Hello again, everyone. It's a lovely sunny day in Morgantown. This is Dr. Zizzi, and we're going to spend a few minutes talking about motivation. Probably one of the least understood concepts and most talked about. So if you're watching ESPN or some other sports broadcast, they often have an opinion about the athlete's motivation, and they say that the team or the athlete just wanted it more. And it's just one of the most ridiculous statements that in sport, that all it takes is you just have to want it more. Think about how easy my job as a sports psychologist would be if an athlete came in and they were like, I really need to perform better, Dr. Zizzi, help me out, and then all I need to tell them is really, you just got to want it more. How come you don't want it more? So it makes motivation seem like a very simplistic concept, and if you didn't win, then obviously you didn't want it more, therefore you're lazy and you're unmotivated. So it's a very simplistic view of motivation, and so hopefully after this chapter and reading some of the theories, you have a better feeling for what exactly is motivation, the things that influence motivation. And that's not quite as simple as that. Frankly, it isn't. One of the big principles of motivation is that we have multiple competing motives, and so I'll try to explain some of that as we go along, and some of the theories that in sports psych are very helpful to understanding your athletes. So this is in the section of your textbook called Understanding Individual Participants, and it truly is very important to understand, well, what is this athlete motivated to achieve? One of my first questions when I work with athletes is, well, why do they even keep playing their sport? And you'd be amazed how many of them haven't even thought about that in years and years and years. So if you're working with a college athlete and you're asking them at 21, why do you keep playing? They really actually have to pause and think about it, because oftentimes it's not so clear to them at that point, and there are always a variety of motivations that influence why they continue to show up at practice every day, not the least of which is typically their scholarship. And so we'll talk about some of the multiple factors that influence motivation. From a textbook definition standpoint, which obviously you need to know for any sort of test, motivation refers to both the direction and the intensity of effort. So oftentimes we only ascribe the intensity as how much effort the effort's putting forth. But the direction is specifically, well, what are they doing? What are they seeking out? What are the specific goals they have? It's almost like, where are you walking? What exactly are you trying to accomplish? Where are you trying to get to? And then, well, how fast are you walking? Are you jogging? Are you running? That's really the intensity of it. So to apply this to like a student context, if I want to say, well, how motivated is this student? It's multifaceted, so do they show up on time? That'll be one, directed behavior. Do they come and ask me questions about an assignment? Do they show up at office hours? Do they complete things that are on eCampus? Do they take the time to proofread their papers? And then when they do show up in class, or they do work on a project, how much effort did they put into that? So in other words, did they just show up and they never ask a question, they're sleeping in the classroom? That's one level of intensity of effort, to show up. Did they not even bother to show up? That's a lower intensity of effort. But then did they show up and they're engaged? That's a different level of motivation. That's a different intensity of effort, and also a different choice or direction of behavior. So there are multiple ways within each context, in sport or out of sport, to understand how motivated is this individual. And sometimes we will ascribe it to only one piece of the equation. So like I work a lot with folks in weight loss, and they might be very motivated, for example, to go work out 5 times a week. And for that 1 hour, they're highly motivated, and they're at the gym, and they get to the gym, and they put good effort in. So their intensity is high when they're there. But they're not necessarily that motivated to change their diet. So they do not put a lot of effort into making good choices, shopping, and avoiding fast food. And so their motivation to change their diet might be quite low. But they're saying, hey, I'm working hard, but they only do it in one aspect of their training. You see this in athletes a lot as well. So they're not no problem in practice. When coach is screaming at them, they're running, they're working hard, they're listening. And if you watch them, they're doing great. But then that's only 15, 20 hours a week. So for the other 140 hours a week, they're really not that motivated to be athletes. So they're out drinking, they're not taking care of themselves, they are not monitoring their nutrition, they're not resting. So that shows a different level of motivation than the athlete that's out there getting rest, taking care of themselves, supporting their teammates, doing other things that shows motivation as well. So you have to have a broad view of this idea of direction and intensity of effort. And there's several useful guidelines in the chapter that I thought are useful for us to go over real quickly. The first is that we talked about in the personality podcast, both situations and traits are going to motivate people. You have to consider the context they're in. That's the coaching situation, the particular team they're on, what are their relationships with their teammates, how's the team performing, and then also the individual person. So some people, no matter what, are going to be just cranking and motivated every single season, every single practice, and regardless of the coach or the situation, they're going to be awesome and highly motivated. There are other people that are much more influenced by the situation. Now, this happens to students all the time, and I'm sure you can relate. You get into a class that the professor is totally boring. It's also a topic you're not that interested in. It's maybe one of your general education requirements. And so the situation has now demotivated you. Because, you're a good student, but you're not a great student maybe, and this class, it just sucks, and I just can't get myself to study for that. Now, on the flip side, there are plenty of students that it doesn't really matter. I can remember very specifically in my freshman year of college, many years ago now, probably about the year you guys were born, I was taking an anthropology class at 8 o'clock in the morning. It was just an awful class. The professor was so boring and sleepy, and I didn't like getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning. And at some point in the semester, sorry about that. Okay, I don't know exactly what happened there, but I'll sort that out later on. Sorry for the interruption. I can remember one point in the semester thinking, this is so bad. I think at midterm I had like a C or B minus or a C, and I was not satisfied with that grade at all. And I decided, you know what, this is not going to affect my GPA. I was really frustrated, and I did not let that situation affect it. So I really did everything I could possibly do on my own to earn extra points, to show up, to study the stuff, so that this particular professor could not ruin my GPA. So that's an example of how my traits and my motivation to do well in school overrode a situation that was potentially, and I'm sure for many of the other students in the class, undermining their motivation, because it was just an awful class, and at 8 o'clock in the morning. I mentioned this one before. People have multiple motives, and those motives change over time. If you ask an athlete, a student athlete particularly, what are some of the things that motivate them, they might still have some love of their sport. For example, they just love playing volleyball. They may also really want to keep their scholarship. They may want to thank mom and dad and impress mom and dad. They might really like their coaches. So there are some shared things. They like their teammates. They want to do well. They want to achieve Big East championship, but those motives may not be different. For example, it may not be the same freshman year as they are junior year. Okay? And so these complex motives change and shift over time and have an influence on us. You identify these things the same way you do in personality. You talk to people specifically, directly. You talk to people around the situation, and then you observe their behavior. So you always want to blend those three sources of information. You may also, in one additional way here, I might add, is you give them some sort of survey. You ask athletes. That might be another way. We have a variety of instruments that they might fill out to give us another source of information. So it's a way of asking them directly, but in a more structured and organized way as well. So we'll typically in sports psychology use a variety of different assessments. These will be called assessments. I might observe in a structured way. I'm going to talk to coaches and maybe some teammates, particularly if I'm working with the whole team. I'm going to talk to the participants directly. I'm going to ask them directly, and then I might have a survey as well. And so then I'm going to try to validate each of the opinions I get. There's a great coaching strategy here is to simply change the environment to enhance motivation. So in my lecture classes, not my online classes, one thing I try to do is I don't use PowerPoint very often, and when I do, it's in a very limited way, because I think students get to see a lot of PowerPoint and get into very much a habit of listening to lectures and PowerPoint. So when you change that and you force students to interact in a different way, it changes motivation and gets them out of that set. So for athletes, Maybe they're showing up every day to long training, take like a swimming situation, and then one day coach says, all right, let's go to the deep end of the pool. Let's just play a water polo for our fitness today. So instead of now the idea of I have to go swim for another 2.5 hours, I get to go play water polo for an hour. All of a sudden now I'm excited, I'm motivated, it changes everything. Or you give folks a day off, or you take them on land, or you do something different to then enhance the motivation, and you add variety to the situation. Leaders have a great impact. Coaches, athletic trainers, physical therapists, sports psychologists, in two ways. One is the strategies they use for reinforcement. You'll see that in your later chapters, chapter 6. How they interact with athletes directly, the feedback they give them, and then indirect by their modeling of behavior. So some of these coaches, they really inspire players just by what they do, how they are as an individual, how they handle themselves. So it's an indirect way they really motivate other people to do well, to follow them. They do it in an indirect way through how they model their behavior. And sports psychologists can do that as well. You can be very passionate and compassionate and enthusiastic and positive, and so by modeling that behavior, athletes may get a little bit of that through osmosis, just from an indirect way. And like I said in chapter 6, you'll learn a little bit more about how to use behavior modification to change, and to use punishment and then reinforcement for some of those other principles. A couple of the key concepts from this particular chapter are achievement motivation and competitiveness. So achievement motivation is a specific form of motivation related to wanting to strive for success, to persist when you fail, and then to feel pride when you achieve your accomplishments. So each of us has a level of achievement motivation in our lives. That's a fairly static thing, almost like a personality characteristic. It relates a little bit to conscientiousness in our personality structure. So the more conscientious we are, the more we are motivated to achieve particular goals across domains. So sport, school, work, and other hobbies and other things. So it's your motivation to achieve and accomplish goals. And obviously you can imagine the higher you are as an athlete in this, then you may be putting more effort into your sport, into your training. And typically those people who are higher in achievement motivation will work harder and respond better to failure. And we'll look at some of that in a moment. Now, competitiveness is strictly focused on comparison and evaluative others. So do we get competitive when someone's watching? And it doesn't really matter whether it's intramurals or the Olympics. Competitiveness will come out. It could be a class competition. If you're a highly competitive individual, and myself and my wife are very competitive people, anytime it's on the line, we're being evaluated, we're not going to lose. Okay, and that's a trait that in elite athletes you will see a lot of. Now, there is value in, of course, working to get better and to work on the tasks that are going to make you better. But to have that element of competitiveness can be both a healthy and an unhealthy thing, and we'll look at the balance of that as well. So competitiveness is making comparisons with a standard, when you're being evaluated and when it's on. And sometimes, the only time this becomes dysfunctional is that athletes will only put effort in when they're being evaluated. So if they're in a off-season workout and no one's really keeping track of them, they're really not putting any effort in. So they're really not getting any better, or they're getting lazy or out of shape or fat. And so they only turn it on when the lights are on, which is great when it comes to game day. But if you have no fitness, then really being motivated and trying to push it in the Olympic marathon, it doesn't matter. At that point you're done. Okay, so competitiveness by itself, without some other achievement motivation underneath of it, can be quite dysfunctional and leads to basically athletes only showing up when, quote, they think it's important. Okay, now, sorry this is just a little bit small, but I think you'll be able to check it out. And of course, you can follow it in the book. Need achievement theory is a theory out of the 1950s by a couple researchers called McClellan and Atkins. And it's a very useful theory to understand patterns that athletes get into. And as I mentioned before, athletes that are focused on only competitiveness and external comparison typically end up in what would be called their motive to avoid failure. And so they end up really avoiding situations that are risky for them, and they perform poorly when they are challenged. So this type of athlete would prefer to either compete against somebody that they're absolutely supposed to kill, that's a really lowly ranked opponent that's way worse than them, or they want to compete against somebody that there's no way they're supposed to win. So in a situation where there's very low probability of success or very high, that's the situation where they are more likely to approach success. Those people who are motivated to achieve success want to be challenged. So they want an evenly matched person. They look for challenges. They seek out situations to achieve and get better, and their performance is enhanced. Whereas those folks who are only motivated to avoid failure, they don't want to be put in a situation where they're truly evaluated. And this pattern can become very dysfunctional over time. So I encourage you definitely to read about this and get familiar with need achievement theory, because it's a core concept in sports psychology, and you'll see a lot of athletes, particularly college athletes and high ability athletes, that get into this situation where they just simply are not comfortable with failure, and basically they're very low on achievement motivation. So they become very low, and they do not want to be honestly evaluated in their performance. Attribution theory is another really great theory that deals with how people explain their successes and failures. And so it's a simple question like, well, why did you think that you performed that way today? And then you let the athlete talk, and you hear what they say, and you try to determine whether that attribution is stable or unstable, is within their control, and whether or not it was caused by them or some external thing. So if the model looks like this, the response can be a stable response, like, well, it's due to I'm just a high level athlete, I'm just really good. So that would be my ability is stable. My unstable might be, well, I had a terrible attitude, or I had a terrible week of training. That would be an unstable thing. Locus of causality, was it due to something internal to me, such as my ability, or such as my effort, my preparation? It could be internal as well. Or was it something that was due to, well, the team was just too good? That's something external. Or luck. Okay, and that would be something that's external and out of one's control. Or the other coach just made a terrible call, or the referee blew something. So that would be external and out of control, versus something that is in one's control. So do we subscribe particular reasons after a loss or after a win? And so there are what are called dysfunctional and functional patterns of attribution that help determine future motivation. So as an example, let's say after I fail, I had a really crappy performance. Let's take tennis. I went out and I didn't play well. I got beat. It was a pretty miserable performance against someone that really was a similar ability to me. But after that performance, I say, you know what? I didn't really train real well this week. I didn't take good care of myself. So that is internal, unstable, and in my control. So I attribute my loss, my poor performance, to poor preparation, didn't have a good attitude, didn't get enough rest. So then in the future, I would be able to change those things. Those are unstable, internal, and in my control, so that I might get a different result in the future. I might be more motivated to do that. Now, let's say that after that same failure, I said, "Oh, I'm awful. I'm just not good." Okay, so it's still internal, but now I'm making it a stable thing. Like, I'm just terrible. This season's awful. I'm never going to have a good season. I have a really negative attitude about it. It's internal, and I just can't get any better. Like, I just have this awful coach, and I start to blame him or her about that, and I don't see how I can perform in this. So then in the future, why would I be motivated to put more effort in? Because I don't have the perception that it can change. So the language athletes use after a success and failure is very useful to try to predict what might you see out of them later on in the next weeks and the next months after that. So give a good read to attribution theory. You will be asked some questions about that on the quiz. And achievement goal theory blends these ideas of competitiveness and achievement motivation, and suggests that you can have both kind of goals, like outcome or competitive oriented goals, or you can have task, both. You don't choose one or the other. You can actually have both, and you can have you blend that with your own perceived ability. So do you feel very competent in this situation, or do you feel very low competence or ability in the situation? And the combination of the goals you choose and then your perceived ability in the situation will predict your own performance, the effort, whether or not you persist in the face of failure, and then what type of tasks you choose. Do you choose a challenging situation, or those that are totally out of bounds for you? So the combination of our achievement motivation and our perceived competence is going to predict some very important things. Particularly, these things are predictive of how hard we work when people aren't watching. So are you going out at night? Are you taking care of your nutrition? What are you doing in your off season? So when people are not keeping us accountable, these are critical pieces of information to determining how we're going to behave. From this line of research, the suggestions are to focus on task-oriented goals. That means getting better, self-improvement, kind of like what the New England Patriots motto is, get better every day. So even though they're trying to kill people on Sunday, and they're super competitive, want to win every game, they focus almost completely on, I'm the linebacker, this is my task, this is what I'm supposed to do, I better get better this week or we're not going to win. I'm the wide receiver, these are my tasks, this is what I'm supposed to do, I need to get better this week or we're not going to win. So it's almost 99% focused on motivational climates that are helping athletes get better at what they do, so therefore the team wins. And so the research is absolutely clear on this. You want to help every single person on the team identify a role, get better at what they're doing, work towards a shared team goal, and not so much focus exclusively on opponents and getting better or the wins and losses. Yes, that's the goal. Yes, you're trying to win, but you're doing it through a very much focus on mastering your task and your skills. Competence suggests that we need to build an environment that helps athletes feel in control, and that each day they're getting feedback somehow from themselves, from their coaches, from their teammates, that are making them feel competent at what they're doing. Like, yeah, I'm good at this. Okay, and I'm getting feedback from my coach that is helping me feel like, yep, I'm getting better, let's go, so that they go into a competition feeling strong in that way. So that feedback and reinforcement that you receive, in addition to some of the things that you bring into the context, affect your perceived control and competence in the situation, your self-esteem, and then out here you're going to see some of the outcomes. So do you enjoy the task? Do you experience anxiety or pride? Anxiety, if you experience that, then you're just going to avoid the situation altogether. Are you happy about it? Do you experience shame because of failure? And then that cycles back into motivation. So these factors here are part of the climate and the situation. So you bring in your own personality and your own motivational orientations. You're exposed to a particular style of feedback and reinforcement, and then it influences your competence, which then is motivation. So thus, competence, motivation theory. So some useful things to think about. So let's look at a couple of the research results related to what we know about high achievers versus lower achievers. Okay, so the high achievers, as I mentioned before, focus on challenges, the pride of success, and they're highly motivated to do well. Okay, and on the opposite end of that, the low achievers focus more on avoiding failure and focus on shame. So the pride of doing well versus shame. So if we have shame, we basically want to avoid situations where we experience shame. High achievers also attribute success to stable or unstable factors within their own control, and they attribute failure to unstable and external factors outside of their control. Okay, now it is functional to have attributions where you're taking responsibility for both. So I wouldn't want always athletes to attribute failure to external and unstable factors. And they usually would adopt goals that are oriented towards getting better, things in their control. Okay, so they're a little bit of a different pattern then of their attributions for high achievers. As you can imagine, high achievers feel very confident. They know what's in their control. They seek out challenges. They seek out demanding tasks, and they perform well under evaluation. Okay, so high achievers feel confident. They are approaching or looking forward to situations where they're evaluated, and they do well in those situations because of that. Now, on the flip side, as I mentioned, the lower achievers worry more about what failure will mean. So that causes them to be very hesitant. They don't put forth full effort, and then they also try to avoid situations in which they're evaluated. They have the opposite pattern of their attributions. So when they succeed, they think it was lucky, it was totally lucky, and I'll never do that again, or that opponent just played terrible. But when they fail, they ascribe it to themselves that maybe they have poor ability and they just suck. So they have a very dysfunctional pattern of attributions, which usually they're focusing so much on, as I mentioned before, they're focused on failure and outcomes so much because they're adopting outcome goals. So they're worried about wins and losses and what that means, and they're not really willing to put in the work to get better because they have very low achievement motivation. Okay, so it's a very dysfunctional pattern. They don't feel confident. They feel like achievement's outside of their control. Therefore, why should they work? So they avoid challenges. They will seek out situations where they're absolutely not supposed to succeed, or where it's absolutely they're going to kill the person in the competition. When they get put in situations where they're evaluated, they're highly stressed. They don't do well. Okay, so big difference between high achievers, those that have a very functional pattern of achievement motivation, and those that have a very low functioning pattern of achievement motivation. Now, as you develop these, where do these come from? Athletes progress through 3 developmental stages that are useful to talk about, and I'll show you a figure in a moment. Basically, you proceed through, and you want to review these. Autonomous, meaning on their own, getting better, feeling your own skills. Moving to social comparison, where you're only evaluating yourself from a social standard, and then an integrated where you're using both. Like hey, I'm okay, I'm fit, I'm doing well at this, but you're also relatively aware of how you compare with other people. And these typically follow like age lines. Usually when kids are young and they're toddlers and they're preschool kind of age, up till about maybe 7 or 8, grade 2 or 3. Individuals are fairly autonomous. They're worried about getting better, self-comparison. Hey, I'm faster, I'm fitter, I can ride a bike, I can throw a ball. They're more worried about themselves. As you move into school age, kids get to be very socially aware. I used to do a lot of work in parks and recreation, a lot of youth programming, and I think for boys it happens a little bit earlier with their skills, just because of the social environment and what they're encouraged to do. So maybe around 9 or 10. And, I'd say middle school is where it really hits high gear, where you're becoming very aware of boy-girl issues. So that social comparison takes over. And then as you go on, you become a little bit older as a young adult and adolescent, you start to integrate both. So it kind of goes from healthy, task-focused, to somewhat unhealthy social comparison, seeing where you fit in, which is a natural developmental stage, into more of an integrated approach after that. So what are some of the implications here for this information? The person in the situation, it still applies here, that you're going to try to be aware of all of these factors that influence an athlete's achievement behavior. So what's their goal orientation? How are they using attributions? What kind of situations are they doing the best in? What are they avoiding? Where are they? And so this kind of blends with personality. What type of a person are you dealing with? And then what is their current typical response when it comes to achievement motivation? Very important in understanding clients that you're working with. Then in terms of interventions, some of the things that really are helpful for athletes is simply to focus on the things that they can control, and then to fix their attributions so that they are starting to use a healthy pattern of self-reinforcement. And then, of course, they're always going to have competitive goals. You never want to take the ego out of the athlete. But ego and win-loss focus without some sort of mastery focus is not a very effective approach to take for athletes. And that's the type of approach that results in athletes getting a fear of failure. You want to make sure that they are able to do this, or that coaches or teammates are going to give them some enhancement of their competence and their perceptions of, here are the things you can control: your preparation, your attitude, your nutrition, your rest, all these things that they're responsible for doing, so that no matter what's happening out externally, who they're competing against, what's the situation, what's the environment like, they're going to have a set of skills that help them get prepared and feel confident to go into competition, which then allows them to go play free and have a positive performance. So hopefully, from the outset here, from talking about the simplicity of motivation and, quote, wanting it more, I don't want to make it seem like rocket science, because it's not physics, trust me. It's not that complicated, but it's definitely more than, hey, this person's just lazy or motivated or whatever. So sometimes coaches or athletic trainers and athletes themselves really miss the point here, and they don't really understand how they can change their own level of motivation through structuring the way they go about their practice environments. So hopefully you got a little bit something out of the lecture, and you're having a better sense for some of these theories, and of course I hope that it helps you perform better on the reading quiz for Unit 1. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.